They say Christmas is for family, but that day, Christmas Eve, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The moment I opened the basement door and saw my son, my own flesh and blood, locked inside, gasping for air, my heart shattered into pieces I feared would never heal. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every day had become an exhausting routine of silence and shadows. Living in a cramped second-floor apartment in Chicago's South Side, my small world smelled of old wood and worn fabric, memories of years where my hands wrung themselves raw. The radiator clanged through winter nights like a metronome counting down my loneliness. I'd spend mornings sweeping the dusty floors, watching particles dance in pale sunlight that barely reached through my grimy windows. Afternoons meant cooking meals that went untouched, stirring pots of soup that grew cold while I waited for visitors who never came. Evenings were the worst, sitting by my phone, watching the numbers on the clock change, hoping for a call that never rang. The city buzzed around me constantly. Car horns blared from State Street below. Distant sirens wailed through the December air. Children's laughter echoed from the playground across the street. But none of it reached my soul anymore. I had become invisible in my own life, a ghost haunting rooms where I once belonged. My apartment felt like a museum of memories nobody wanted to visit. Faded photographs lined the windowsills, pictures of birthday parties, graduations, first days of school. My son's face smiled back at me from frames that hadn't been dusted in weeks. His children, my grandchildren, frozen in time when they still wanted my hugs. The couch where I spent most evenings was worn thin from worry and waiting. The kitchen table sat empty, set for one, though I kept buying groceries for a family that no longer existed. That Christmas Eve, hope flickered in my chest like a dying candle. I had wrapped a simple gift in faded red paper. Nothing expensive, just a photo album filled with memories I thought he might treasure. The paper crinkled under my trembling fingers as I tied a bow with ribbon I'd saved from last year. My coat hung heavy on my shoulders as I walked the 6 blocks to his house, each step echoing promises I made to myself about how this time would be different. The house stood before me like a fortress. Windows glowed warmly from inside, and I could smell something cooking, maybe ham, maybe turkey. I imagined the scene waiting for me. My son's wife bustling in the kitchen, children playing on the carpet, laughter spilling from room to room. My heart raced with anticipation as I climbed the front steps, gift clutched against my chest. Instead, silence met me at the door. The house felt cold, despite the burning lights. No voices drifted from the kitchen. No children's footsteps pattered across the floors. The air hung heavy with something I couldn't name. Something wrong. Something twisted. I called out hello, but my voice seemed to die before it reached anyone's ears. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Ragged breathing coming from below. From the basement. My blood turned to ice as I followed that desperate sound down creaking wooden stairs. Each step felt like descending into hell itself. The basement door was locked. A padlock hung from the latch like an accusation. Through the gap at the bottom, I could hear him gasping, struggling, calling out in a voice I barely recognized. My son, my baby, locked away like a criminal, like a secret too shameful to acknowledge. I couldn't breathe. The world tilted sideways as I fumbled with my phone, hands shaking so violently I could barely dial. When the police arrived, when that door finally opened, when I saw what had been done to my child, my heart broke in ways I didn't know were possible. This wasn't the first betrayal, though. It was just the one that finally opened my eyes. For decades, I had given everything to hold our family together. After his father walked away, just packed his bags one Tuesday morning and disappeared like smoke, I became everything to everyone. Mother and father, provider and protector. I was 28 years old with a 3-year-old son and dreams I buried beneath diapers and debt. I worked double shifts cleaning offices downtown, my knees screaming against marble floors, my hands cracked from chemicals and cold. I skipped meals so he could eat. I wore the same coat for 5 winters so he could have new shoes for school. When other mothers attended PTA meetings, I was mopping conference rooms in empty buildings, counting quarters for his lunch money. I raised my grandchildren too, when his teenage mistakes became tiny lives that needed love. Sarah and Tommy came to me when they were barely walking, their mother too young and scared to handle responsibility. I potty trained them, taught them to read, held them through nightmares while their father chased dreams that always seemed just out of reach. The years blurred together in a haze of sacrifice that nobody seemed to notice. I patched up scraped knees and broken hearts. I stayed up nights helping with homework while my back ached from cleaning stairs. I gave and gave until I forgot what it felt like to receive. But the thanks never came. The appreciation was a ghost that haunted my expectations. Instead, I got silence. Cold shoulders, muttered complaints about how I didn't understand, how I was too demanding, how I expected too much. "Mom, you don't have to do everything," my son would say. But his tone suggested I was overstepping, not helping. The edge in his voice cut deeper than gratitude could ever heal. When drugs nearly destroyed him at 25, I scraped together every dollar I had for rehab. I sold my car. I pawned my wedding ring. I took out loans against my future to pay for his treatment. While he was getting clean, I cleaned houses to afford my own groceries. He came out grateful, tears in his eyes, promises on his lips. "I'll pay you back, Mom. I'll make this right." Those words were like oxygen to my drowning heart. But gratitude fades faster than morning dew in Chicago heat. Within 6 months, he was asking for more money. His small business, a food truck that sold hot dogs near Navy Pier, was struggling. The equipment needed repairs. The city permits cost more than expected. The location fees were eating his profit. I handed over my savings without question. What else could I do? He was my son. "You don't understand how business works." He'd snap when I asked about repayment. "I'm doing my best here. Quit nagging me about money all the time." But I wasn't nagging about money. I was drowning without it. My own rent was late. My groceries came from food pantries. I couldn't afford winter boots, so I wrapped my feet in plastic bags inside my old ones. Every dollar I gave him was a dollar I took from my own mouth. The cold shoulders grew colder. The thank yous stopped coming entirely. I began to wonder if my love had become a chain around his neck, something he wore not out of affection, but obligation. Was I helping, or was I just making it easier for him to avoid responsibility? The doubt ate at me like acid in my stomach. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too demanding, too involved, too much. The microaggressions started small, like paper cuts that barely register until you realize you're bleeding. Birthdays passed without phone calls. Not even text messages. I'd sit by my kitchen window watching for the mailman, hoping for a card that never came. My 70th birthday was the worst. I baked myself a cake and ate it alone while watching game shows on my tiny television. Mother's Day became another ordinary Sunday. I learned to expect nothing so I wouldn't be disappointed, but the emptiness still carved holes in my chest. When I got sick with pneumonia that winter, I called his number 7 times. 7 times, it went to voicemail. I left messages between coughing fits, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm really not feeling well. Could you maybe pick up some medicine? Or just check on me?" He finally called back 3 days later, annoyed. "What's wrong now?" "I've been busy with the truck." By then, I'd crawled to the pharmacy myself, fever burning through my skull, lungs rattling with every breath. Mira, my neighbor, found me collapsed on the stairs. She stayed with me that night, making tea, checking my temperature, being the family I wished I had. The children, my grandchildren, began avoiding me too. Sarah, now 16, rolled her eyes when I tried to talk to her. Tommy, 13, acted like I was invisible. They'd been taught, somehow, that I was the burden, the needy grandmother who asked for too much attention. But the real betrayal came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I found the text messages by accident, his phone lying face up on my kitchen table while he used my bathroom. The screen lit up with notifications from his wife, messages that made my blood freeze. "Did you tell your mom about the truck yet? God, I hope she doesn't want to come to dinner again. She's so pathetic, always calling and wanting attention. Maybe if we ignore her long enough, she'll get the hint." They were laughing about me, mocking my loneliness, sharing screenshots of my worried messages like they were comedy sketches. My own son, the boy I raised with my sweat and tears, was entertaining his wife by ridiculing my love. I set the phone down carefully, hands trembling. I didn't say anything when he came back. I just smiled and offered him coffee like my heart wasn't bleeding all over my kitchen floor. That was the beginning of the end. Or maybe it was the beginning of the beginning. The locked basement changed everything. Seeing my son trapped, hearing him struggle for breath, realizing that the family I'd built through sacrifice had become something monstrous. It shattered every illusion I'd been clinging to. When the police freed him, when the paramedics checked his breathing, when the questions started flying about who had done this and why, the truth came out in jagged pieces that cut us all. His wife, the mother of my grandchildren. She'd been stealing money from the business for months. When he finally discovered it, when he confronted her, she'd turned the children against him, convinced them he was dangerous, had him locked in their own basement while she cleaned out their bank accounts and prepared to disappear. My son, my complicated, struggling son, had been a victim too. But the damage was already done. Trust had been shattered. The family I thought I knew was a house of cards that had finally collapsed. That night, as I sat in my apartment staring at the gift I'd never gotten to give, I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. I was done. Done being the family ATM. Done accepting crumbs of affection as payment for unconditional love. Done being invisible in the lives I'd helped create. The teacup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor. The sound was sharp and final, like a period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for 70 years. I sat among the porcelain pieces and cried. Not just for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never really had. For the first time in decades, I whispered the word that had been trapped in my throat like a stone. No. But saying no felt like learning a foreign language at my age. The fear wrapped around my heart like winter wind. What if they cut me out completely? What if my grandchildren forgot I existed? What if loneliness became my only companion? Still, I packed away the photographs that night. Each picture went into a dusty shoebox. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings when their faces still lit up at the sight of me. I couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Those moments felt like lies now, happiness borrowed against a future that would never come. I caught myself in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth. The woman staring back looked ancient, defeated. Her eyes were hollow caves where hope used to live. Her shoulders curved inward like parentheses around emptiness. I barely recognized myself. Who was I without them? Without the role of provider, caretaker, grandmother, mother? Without someone to worry about, someone to sacrifice for, someone to love even when that love wasn't returned. The questions followed me to bed, where I lay awake listening to the radiator clang and the city breathe outside my window. Somewhere in those sleepless hours, something shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it, a tiny seed of anger was beginning to sprout. I deserved better than this. Didn't I? When I finally confronted my son about that Christmas Eve night, his reaction was a tornado of denial and rage. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral ground, where I hoped civility might survive the conversation. "You're imagining things," he spat, his voice loud enough to turn heads at neighboring tables. "Mom, you've lost your mind. Sarah didn't lock me anywhere. You're making up stories." But I'd seen the police report. I'd heard his gasping through that basement door. I'd watched the paramedics check his vitals while his wife stood in the corner, calculating her next move. She was protecting herself from you, he continued, his loyalty to her unwavering even after what she'd done. You don't know what really happened. You just want to cause drama like always. My daughter-in-law wasn't there, but her influence hung in the air between us. She'd already begun rewriting history, painting me as the villain who wanted to destroy their marriage. My son had chosen his side. My grandchildren avoided eye contact when I tried to explain. Sarah texted during our entire conversation. Tommy played games on his phone. They'd been taught that I was the problem, the crazy grandmother who saw things that weren't there. Each family member tried to twist my words differently. Sarah, now 17, accused me of being jealous of her mother. You can't stand that Dad has someone else to take care of him now, she said with the cruelty only teenagers can master. Tommy just shrugged. I don't know why you're making such a big deal about everything, Grandma. You're always complaining about something. Us, but then there was Mira. Sweet Mira from next door, with her thick Polish accent and hands that always smelled like flour. She brought me hot tea in a thermos and sat on my apartment steps while I cried ugly tears into the Chicago wind. You are good woman, she said simply, patting my shoulder with flour-dusted fingers. Sometimes good womens are treated bad by peoples who supposed to love them. Is not your fault. She didn't try to fix anything, didn't offer advice or solutions, just held space for my pain like it was precious cargo she'd been trusted to carry. Mira had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children, mostly alone. She understood the weight of sacrifice, the ache of unappreciated love. In her weathered face, I saw my own struggles reflected with dignity instead of shame. What do? I whispered into her thermos steam. You do what you need for you, she said. Family is supposed to be blessing, not curse. If they make curse from you, you make your own blessing. Her broken English carried more wisdom than all my son's perfect explanations. That night, I stared at my bank statement spread across my kitchen table. 40 years of giving, loans that were never repaid, emergency funds I'd scraped together from cleaning supply closets and counting pennies, my retirement account, nearly empty from bailing out his business ventures. The numbers told a story I'd been too loyal to read before. I wasn't helping him succeed. I was enabling him to avoid the consequences of his choices. The first concrete act of freedom felt like stepping off solid ground into thin air. When he called asking for another loan, just $5,000 to cover the truck's repair bills, I said the word I'd been practicing in my mirror. No. The silence on the other end of the line stretched like taffy. Then came the manipulation, rolling over me like a familiar tide. Mom, you know I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. The truck's my whole livelihood. What am I supposed to tell the kids when we lose everything? Tell them their father is going to figure it out, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You're being cruel, after everything I've been through with Sarah. After everything you've put me through, I interrupted. The words tasted strange in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew. I'm done, honey. I love you, but I'm done being your bank account. I hung up before he could respond. My hands shook for an hour afterward. I paced my apartment like a caged animal, second-guessing every word. But something had shifted inside me. Some tectonic plate that had been under pressure for decades. I started seeing a therapist the next week. Dr. Martinez had an office in a community center on Halsted Street, with sliding scale fees I could actually afford. The walls were covered with inspirational posters that might have seemed cheesy in other circumstances, but felt like life preservers in my storm. Tell me about your relationship with your son, she said during our first session. For 50 minutes, words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, stories I'd never told anyone. Hurt I'd carried in silence for years, the shame of feeling used by the person I loved most. Do you think it's possible? She asked gently. that your giving has become a form of enabling. The question hit me like cold water. I'd always seen my sacrifices as love in action, but maybe love without boundaries wasn't love at all. Maybe it was just fear dressed up in noble clothes. Setting boundaries felt like learning to walk again. Dr. Martinez helped me practice saying no to small things first. No to babysitting on my only day off. No to lending my car when mine was already falling apart. No to hosting family dinners that left me exhausted and unappreciated. Each no felt like betrayal at first, like I was abandoning my role as the family foundation. But slowly, space opened up in my life, space for things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. I started taking long walks in Calumet Park, watching Lake Michigan stretch toward the horizon like possibility itself. The wind off the water washed away years of heavy silence. For the first time in decades, my thoughts weren't consumed with worry about someone else's problems. That first day living entirely for myself was profound in its simplicity. I bought groceries for one person, just me, and didn't feel guilty about it. I cooked a meal I actually wanted to eat, not something designed to please ungrateful palates. I watched a movie I chose, without checking if anyone else would approve. When evening came, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and realized something miraculous. I felt peaceful. Not the exhausted peace of collapse after a crisis, but the deep contentment of a soul finally allowed to rest. That night, for the first time in years, sleep came gently. No phone beside my pillow in case of emergency. No ears straining for sounds of crisis. Just the quiet breathing of a woman learning to live for herself again. I consulted a lawyer about my rights the following week. Legal Aid of Cook County had an office that smelled like old coffee and determination. The attorney, a young woman named Rachel, listened to my story with the kind of attention I'd forgotten was possible. "You're not legally obligated to support adult children," she explained, sliding papers across a desk scarred with years of desperate signatures. "Even if they've made you feel like you are." She helped me understand that financial abuse could happen within families. That manipulation was still manipulation, even when it came from people you loved. That I had the right to say no without justifying my reasons to anyone. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a cave. The Chicago streets looked different somehow. Brighter, sharper, full of possibility instead of obligation. But my family wasn't ready to let go of their safety net that easily. The New Year's gathering that year would become the final battlefield. I arrived at my son's house carrying the dusty shoebox instead of presents. My stomach churned with nervous energy, but my resolve felt solid as concrete. The living room fell silent when I set the box on the coffee table. Faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. Sarah looked up from her phone for the first time in months. Tommy paused his video game. My son's wife, who hadn't spoken to me since the basement incident, watched me with calculating eyes. "I brought something to share with all of you," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. I opened the box and pulled out photograph after photograph. Birthday parties where I'd spent my last dollars on decorations. Christmas mornings when I'd wrapped presents bought with grocery money. Graduations where I'd sat alone in crowds of celebrating families. "These are memories of a family that doesn't exist anymore," I said, tearing the first photograph slowly in half. A family where love went one direction and respect was optional. The room erupted in protests. "Mom, what are you doing? Grandma, you're being crazy. This is so dramatic and unnecessary." But I kept tearing. Each ripped photograph was a chain broken, a burden lifted, a silent scream finally given voice. The family portrait, all of us smiling at a photographer who charged more than my monthly rent, I tore with particular ceremony. Right down the middle, separating myself from people who treated my love like a subscription service they could cancel at will. "I'm done buying affection," I announced. The scraps of our pretend happiness scattered across the carpet like confetti at a funeral. I'm done accepting crumbs and calling them cake. I'm done being invisible in lives I helped create. My son's wife finally spoke, her voice dripping with practiced victimhood. This is exactly why we need space from you. You're too emotional, too demanding. The children shouldn't have to deal with this kind of manipulation. The word manipulation hung in the air like smoke. Coming from her, the woman who'd stolen money and locked her husband in a basement, it might have been funny if it wasn't so cruel. Respect me or lose me, I said, looking each of them in the eye. Those are your choices now. The threats came next, predictable as sunrise. They'd cut off all contact. I'd never see my grandchildren again. I'd die alone and bitter, and they wouldn't even come to my funeral. Each threat was supposed to be a knife to my heart. Instead, they felt like doors slamming on rooms I no longer wanted to enter. Then that's your choice to make, I said, gathering the empty shoebox and walking toward the door. But I won't be waiting by my phone anymore. I won't be your backup plan or your emergency fund. I'm going to live for me now. The silence behind me was deafening. No pleas for me to stay, no apologies. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, they'd taken me for granted. I walked home through Chicago snow that felt like blessing instead of burden. Each step was lighter than the one before. The weight I'd carried for so many years wasn't gone entirely, but it had shifted from my shoulders to somewhere I could actually carry it. That night, I called Dr. Martinez and left a voicemail. I did it. I actually did it. And I'm still breathing. For weeks afterward, I waited for the regret to hit, for the loneliness to swallow me whole, for the doubt to creep back in and convince me I'd made a terrible mistake. But what came instead was something unexpected. Relief. Relief from not checking my phone every 5 minutes. Relief from not calculating how much I could afford to give away each month. Relief from not performing gratitude for breadcrumbs of attention. My apartment began to feel like home instead of a waiting room. I bought flowers for my kitchen table, not for company, but because I liked how they looked in the morning light. I cooked elaborate meals for myself and savored every bite. I read books I'd been too tired to enjoy for years. Mira started joining me for tea every afternoon. We'd sit by my window, watching the neighborhood change with the seasons, sharing stories without keeping score of who talked more. "You look different," she said one April morning, studying my face over her steaming cup. I felt different, lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a backpack full of rocks and finally realized I could set it down. But the final test was coming, though I didn't know it yet. 3 months after our New Year's confrontation, my old friend Linda called. Linda and I had worked together at the cleaning company years ago, before family obligations consumed my social life. We'd lost touch when I became too busy being needed to remember I had needs too. "I heard about what happened with your family," she said carefully. "From Mira. She's worried about you." I assured her I was fine, better than fine actually. But what she said next knocked the breath out of me. "There's something you need to know. About your son and his business." The story she told me painted a picture so ugly I almost couldn't absorb it. My son had been using my loan money not for truck repairs, but to fund gambling debts. The food truck had been profitable for months, but he'd been feeding his winnings and losses into poker games in back rooms of bars I'd never heard of. When his debt got too high, when the wrong people started making threats, he'd come to me with stories about business expenses and broken equipment. Every dollar I'd given him had gone straight into the pockets of bookies and loan sharks. "He's been bragging about it," Linda said, her voice heavy with regret. "At the bar where my nephew works, talking about his sweet old mom who always came through with cash, no questions asked. He called you his personal ATM, who was too stupid to realize she was being played." The words hit me like physical blows. Personal ATM. Too stupid to realize. The boy I'd raised, whose diapers I'd changed, whose nightmares I'd soothed, had been entertaining strangers with stories of my stupidity and generosity. But here's the thing that surprised me most. I didn't crumble. 6 months earlier, this revelation would have destroyed me. I would have blamed myself for being foolish, for not seeing the signs, for failing him somehow. I would have reached for my checkbook and tried to fix the problem like always. Instead, I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling sad but not shattered, disappointed but not defeated. He'd made his choices. I'd made mine. The consequences belonged to their owners now. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I went to a wine bar in Lincoln Park, ordered a glass of expensive red wine, and toasted my own courage. The other patrons probably thought I was a lonely old woman drinking away her sorrows. They had no idea they were watching a resurrection. Spring in Chicago felt different that year. The city bloomed around me like a promise kept. Tulips pushed through sidewalk cracks, proving that beauty could grow anywhere if it was determined enough. I started taking photography classes at the community center, learning to see the world through a lens that captured what I wanted to remember instead of what I wanted to forget. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in May. I was walking through Millennium Park, camera around my neck, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my granddaughter. "Grandma, can we talk? I think I understand some things now." My first instinct was to call immediately, to rush toward any crumb of connection she might offer. But I'd learned the difference between desperation and healthy hope. I finished my walk, took my photographs, had lunch by myself at a cafe with outdoor seating. When I finally called her back that evening, her voice sounded different. Older somehow. Less certain of the narratives she'd been told. "Mom and Dad are getting divorced," she said without preamble. "He finally told me the truth about some things, about the money you gave him, about why you stopped coming around." She was 18 now, old enough to understand that families weren't always what they appeared to be. Old enough to question the stories she'd been told about her mean, demanding grandmother, who'd abandoned them for selfish reasons. "I don't expect you to forgive us," she continued, "but I wanted you to know that I see it differently now. What you did, what we did to you." The conversation lasted 2 hours. She cried. I cried. We talked about the real reasons I'd stopped participating in family gatherings, about the difference between love and enabling, about how respect was supposed to flow both ways in healthy relationships. But I didn't rush back into anything. I'd learned that reconciliation without changed behavior was just repeated heartbreak with better marketing. Instead, I suggested we start small. Coffee once a month. No agenda, no fixing each other, no catching up on years of missed connections all at once. Just 2 people learning to know each other again. Tommy reached out a few weeks later, his message shorter but equally meaningful. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I was too young to understand before." My son never called, never texted, never acknowledged that his gambling had cost him more than money. It had cost him his mother's trust and his children's respect. His pride, the same pride that had kept him from admitting his problems for so long, became the wall that kept us apart even after the truth emerged. I mourned that loss, but I didn't let it define my healing. That summer, I did something I'd never done in my entire 71 years of life. I took a vacation alone. Not a weekend visit to relatives who might need my help, not a trip centered around someone else's needs or schedule, but a real vacation for my own pleasure. I chose New York City because I'd always wanted to see Central Park in summer. The train ride from Union Station felt like time travel, carrying me away from everything familiar toward something entirely mine. The city overwhelmed me at first. So many people, so much noise, so much life happening all around me without requiring my participation or permission. I wandered through museums where art hung on walls regardless of whether anyone appreciated it. I ate at restaurants where the servers didn't know my history or my heartache. In Central Park, sitting on a bench watching children play while their parents chatted nearby, I realized something profound. I was happy. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince themselves everything was fine, but the deep contentment of a person finally living in alignment with her values. I struck up a conversation with another woman my age, a retired teacher from Brooklyn who was reading the same book I'd brought with me. Maria had raised 3 children alone after her husband died young, and she understood the particular exhaustion of single motherhood that extends into grandmotherhood. The hardest part, she told me over coffee at a sidewalk cafe, was learning that loving someone doesn't mean you have to accept being treated badly by them. We exchanged numbers, promised to keep in touch. For the first time in years, I felt excited about building a new friendship based on mutual interests instead of family obligations. Back home in Chicago, I began transforming my apartment from a shrine to disappointed hopes into a sanctuary for actual living. Gone were the guilt-inducing photographs and the furniture arranged for company that rarely came. Instead, I arranged my space for my own comfort. I bought a reading chair that fit my body perfectly. I hung artwork that made me smile instead of artwork that reminded me of people who'd hurt my feelings. I filled my refrigerator with foods I actually enjoyed eating instead of ingredients for meals designed to please ungrateful visitors. The changes were subtle but revolutionary. My apartment became a place I wanted to be instead of a place I hid when I had nowhere else to go. Mira noticed the transformation immediately. "You are becoming yourself again," she said, clapping her flour-dusted hands together. "Is beautiful thing to watch." She was right. I was becoming myself again. But it was more than that. I was becoming a version of myself I'd never allowed to exist before. A woman who valued her own comfort, who prioritized her own peace, who understood that self-care wasn't selfish if it allowed you to love others from a place of fullness instead of emptiness. The holidays that year tested all my new boundaries. Thanksgiving came and went without an invitation from my son's family. Christmas Eve found me volunteering at a soup kitchen instead of waiting by a phone that wouldn't ring. New Year's Eve was quieter than I'd expected, but fuller than I'd feared. I spent it with Mira and her daughter's family, eating pierogi and listening to stories in accented English that felt more like home than my biological family's gatherings had in years. When midnight came, I kissed Mira's cheeks and felt gratitude instead of loneliness. "This year will be a good year for you," Mira predicted with the certainty of someone who'd survived enough winters to recognize the signs of spring. She was right about that, too. The art classes I'd started led to a part-time job teaching photography at the senior center. Not because I needed the money, though it helped, but because I'd discovered I had something valuable to share. Young seniors, folks in their 60s and 70s, gathered around my camera like children around a storyteller. The secret to good photography, I'd tell them, is learning to see what's actually there instead of what you wish was there. The lesson applied to more than pictures. My friendship with Sarah and Tommy grew slowly but steadily. We met for lunch once a month, sometimes more often. They told me about their lives, school, relationships, dreams for the future. I listened without offering unsolicited advice or trying to fix their problems. It was a different kind of relationship than we'd had before, built on genuine interest instead of obligation. Sarah started calling me for advice about college applications. Tommy asked for help with a photography project for school. These weren't emergency calls from people who needed me to solve their crises, but conversations between people who enjoyed each other's company. The difference was everything. My son remained absent from this healing. His gambling debts had caught up with him in ways that went beyond money. His marriage ended in a divorce that left him sharing custody of children who'd lost respect for him. The food truck business failed when he couldn't focus on anything except his next bet. I heard updates through Linda, through Mira, through the grandchildren who sometimes mentioned him in passing. He was living in a studio apartment, working as a delivery driver, attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week. Part of me wanted to reach out. The mother in me that had bandaged his childhood scrapes still ached when I heard he was struggling. but I'd learned to distinguish between healthy concern and codependent rescuing. He was an adult facing the consequences of his choices. My intervention wouldn't help him. It would only enable him to avoid the lessons his pain was trying to teach him. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that sometimes love means stepping back and allowing people to experience the results of their actions. You can love someone completely while refusing to participate in their destruction, she reminded me during one of our sessions. Spring arrived again, my second spring as a woman learning to live for herself. The city bloomed around me with possibilities I was finally free to explore. I joined a book club, started volunteering at the animal shelter, took weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to see but never had time to visit, when every spare moment was consumed by family drama. Each new experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost along the way. The woman who loved art, who enjoyed travel, who had opinions about books and movies and current events beyond how they affected her family's well-being. I was rediscovering the person I'd been before I defined myself entirely through my relationships with other people. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in April, almost 2 years after that Christmas Eve that changed everything. Sarah's voice was different, excited but nervous, like someone about to share news that might be either wonderful or terrible depending on the reaction. "Grandma, I'm getting married," she said without preamble. "And I want you to be there. Not just invited. I want you to be part of it. Will you walk me down the aisle?" The question hit me like sunshine after a long winter. Traditional weddings usually featured fathers walking daughters down aisles, but Sarah's father had chosen gambling over family stability. I was the steady adult who'd shown up when it mattered. "I would be honored," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Planning her wedding became an exercise in healthy boundary setting. I offered to help with expenses, but not to the point of financial stress. I gave advice when asked, but didn't try to control decisions that belonged to the bride and groom. I participated fully while maintaining my new understanding of the difference between supporting someone and becoming responsible for their happiness. The wedding was beautiful in ways that went beyond flowers and music. It was a celebration of people choosing each other, committing to building something together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The kind of relationship I'd dreamed of having with my family but never quite achieved. When I walked Sarah down the aisle, her arm linked through mine, I felt the weight of everything we'd both survived and overcome. She looked radiant, not just because of the dress and makeup, but because she glowed with the confidence of a young woman who knew she was loved without conditions. "Thank you," she whispered as we reached the altar, "for showing me what healthy love looks like." Those words were worth more than every dollar I'd ever loaned, every sacrifice I'd ever made, every sleepless night I'd ever endured worrying about people who took my love for granted. My son wasn't there. He and Sarah had spoken sporadically since her parents' divorce, but their relationship remained strained by years of disappointment and broken promises. She'd invited him, but he'd declined without explanation. His absence felt like a closed door rather than an open wound. I'd made peace with his choices, even if I couldn't understand them. Tommy gave a speech at the reception that made everyone laugh and cry. He talked about his sister's strength, her kindness, the example she'd set by choosing love over fear. At the end, he raised his glass and said, "And to Grandma, who taught us that family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when it matters." The applause that followed felt like absolution for every doubt I'd carried about my worth, my choices, my right to demand respectful treatment from people who claimed to love me. That night, in my hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, I video called Maria, my friend from New York. She'd become a regular part of my life, someone who understood the particular challenges and joys of starting over at our age. "How was the wedding?" she asked, her familiar face filling the screen. I told her everything, the ceremony, the reception, the conversations with relatives I hadn't seen in years who treated me with warmth instead of obligation. But mostly I told her about the feeling I'd carried all day, the sense of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. "You've built something beautiful," Maria said, "not just with your family, but with yourself. You remember who you were before you became everyone else's solution to everything." She was right. I had remembered. More than that, I'd discovered parts of myself that had never had the chance to develop before. The woman I was at 71 was stronger, wiser, more complete than the woman I'd been at 30 or 50 or even 70. Summer passed in a blur of contentment that felt surreal after so many years of anxiety and disappointment. My photography students gave me a coffee mug that said "World's Best Teacher" and meant it. Mira and I took day trips to places within driving distance of Chicago, small towns with antique shops and cafes, state parks where we could walk trails and talk about everything and nothing. My relationship with my grandchildren continued to deepen in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. They called to share good news and bad news, asked for advice they actually wanted to hear, included me in their lives because they enjoyed my company rather than because they felt obligated. But the real transformation showed itself in quiet moments. Mornings when I woke up looking forward to the day instead of dreading it. Evenings when I felt satisfied with how I'd spent my time instead of guilty about what I hadn't accomplished for other people. Nights when sleep came easily, because my conscience was clear, and my heart was peaceful. The anniversary of that Christmas Eve discovery arrived with snow and the kind of cold Chicago wind that cuts through winter coats like frozen blades. I spent the morning looking through my journals from that time, reading entries filled with confusion, heartbreak, and slowly growing resolve. "I don't know who I am if I'm not taking care of someone else," I'd written a few days after the confrontation. "But I'm tired of being nobody to the people I love most." The distance between that woman and who I'd become felt measured in light years rather than months. She'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being lonely in a crowd of people who took her for granted. She'd confused being needed with being loved, being useful with being valued. I walked to the coffee shop where I'd had that terrible conversation with my son almost 2 years ago. The same barista worked behind the counter, though she didn't remember me. I ordered the same drink and sat at a different table, watching snow fall past windows that hadn't been washed since my last visit. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, my heart jumped. Could it be my son, finally ready to rebuild what we'd broken? Instead, it was a wrong number message about holiday plans. But the disappointment I felt was gentle, manageable. I'd learned the difference between hoping for reconciliation and needing it for my own well-being. If my son ever decided to do the work necessary to rebuild our relationship, accepting responsibility for his choices, making amends for the damage he'd caused, proving through actions that he'd changed, I would welcome that conversation. But my happiness no longer depended on his participation. That evening, I hosted my own small holiday gathering. Maria had flown in from New York. Mira brought her daughter and grandchildren. Sarah and Tommy came with their significant others. Dr. Martinez stopped by with wine and stories about her other clients who'd learned to set boundaries with difficult family members. We ate food everyone actually enjoyed, instead of traditional dishes nobody really wanted. We told stories that made us laugh instead of walking on eggshells around sensitive topics. We played games and listened to music and created new traditions based on what brought us joy rather than what we felt obligated to preserve. Before everyone left, Maria pulled me aside in my kitchen. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked, gesturing toward the living room where people who cared about each other were saying genuine goodbyes. "What do you mean?" "You've created the family you always wanted. Not through biology or obligation, but through choice, through treating people well and accepting the same treatment in return." I looked around at the faces illuminated by Christmas lights I'd hung because I liked them, not because anyone expected them. Mira teaching Tommy a card game in Polish and English. Sarah showing Maria photographs from her wedding. Dr. Martinez deep in conversation with Maria's daughter about graduate school applications. This was what healthy love looked like, mutual respect, genuine interest. People choosing to spend time together because they enjoyed each other's company, not because they needed something from each other. As I cleaned dishes later that night, I thought about all the Christmases I'd spent cooking elaborate meals for people who criticized the food, buying expensive gifts for people who forgot to say thank you, desperately trying to recreate some magazine version of family happiness that none of us actually wanted. This Christmas had cost less money and required less preparation than any holiday I'd hosted in decades, but it had given me more joy than all those other gatherings combined. The difference was choice. Everyone in my living room tonight had chosen to be there, had wanted to celebrate with me, had contributed to the evening instead of just consuming what I provided. New Year's Eve found me in Times Square with Maria and 3 other women we'd met in our photography class. At 71 years old, I was watching the ball drop in person for the first time in my life. The crowd pressed around us, thousands of people celebrating the possibility of fresh starts and new beginnings. When midnight came, when the confetti fell like snow and strangers hugged strangers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated happiness. Not happiness about what might happen or what had been resolved, but happiness about what was happening right then, in that moment, surrounded by people who chose to celebrate with me. "Resolution time," Maria shouted over the noise. "What are you hoping for this year?" I thought about it while fireworks lit up the sky above Manhattan. What did I want from the year ahead? "More of this," I said, gesturing at the celebration around us, the friends beside me, the city spread out like a promise. More choosing what makes me happy instead of what makes other people comfortable. The train ride back to Chicago gave me hours to reflect on everything that had changed since that Christmas Eve discovery in my son's basement. I'd lost a son, but gained myself. I'd stopped being a mother in the way I'd understood motherhood and learned to be a grandmother in ways that actually worked. Most importantly, I'd learned that love without respect was just dressed-up dysfunction. That kindness without boundaries was enabling. That sacrifice without appreciation was martyrdom, not virtue. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself was eager to celebrate new beginnings. I started planning another trip, this time to Italy, where Maria had connections and photography opportunities were endless. At 71, I was finally living the adventurous life I'd dreamed of at 21, but had been too busy taking care of everyone else to pursue. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately. My name and address written in the careful script my son had learned in Catholic school 40 years ago. My hands shook as I opened it, not from fear, but from curiosity. What could he possibly have to say after 2 years of silence? The letter was 3 pages long, written on lined paper torn from a notebook. His words were different than I'd ever heard from him. Humble instead of defensive. Accountable instead of blame-shifting. He'd been in therapy for 6 months. In addition to Gamblers Anonymous, he was attending counseling to address what his therapist called financial abuse toward family members. He'd made a complete accounting of every dollar I'd given him over the years and was working on a payment plan, even though he knew I'd never asked for the money back. Most importantly, he apologized, not for making mistakes, but for treating me as if my love was worthless, for taking advantage of my generosity, for teaching his children that it was acceptable to exploit people who cared about them. "I know an apology isn't enough," he wrote, "and I know I haven't earned the right to a relationship with you. But I wanted you to know that I see now what I did. I see how badly I treated the person who deserved my respect most. If you're willing to meet for coffee sometime, with no expectations, no agenda except for me to say this to your face, I would be grateful for that chance." I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. The woman I'd been 2 years ago would have called immediately, would have rushed to accept any gesture toward reconciliation. But I'd learned to sit with complicated emotions instead of reacting to them. Over the next few days, I talked it through with Dr. Martinez, with Maria, with Mira. I asked myself what I wanted from a relationship with my son, what I could realistically expect, what I was and wasn't willing to accept. The conversation, when it happened, took place at a different coffee shop in a different part of town. Neutral territory where neither of us carried the weight of previous confrontations. He looked older, thinner, like someone who'd been carrying heavy truths. His eyes met mine directly instead of darting away like they had during our last conversation. He didn't make excuses or offer explanations for why he'd taken so long to reach out. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About all of it. How I treated you, how I let them treat you, how I used your love against you. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I needed you to hear me say it." We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his therapy sessions, his recovery process, his divorce, and the custody arrangements that were teaching him to be a more present father. He asked about my life, not as a way to deflect from his own accountability, but with genuine curiosity about who I'd become since we'd stopped speaking. When he offered to start paying back the money, I surprised us both by declining. "Keep it," I said. "Use it for therapy, for your children's needs, for building the life you want to have. But don't ever ask me for money again, and don't ever treat my love like it's optional." We agreed to meet once a month. No expectations beyond honest conversation and mutual respect. He would have to rebuild trust through consistency over time, not through grand gestures or emotional appeals. It wasn't a Hollywood reunion with tears and hugs and instant forgiveness. It was something more valuable. The beginning of an adult relationship between two people who'd learned hard lessons about love and respect. Summer brought Sarah's news that she was pregnant, my first great-grandchild due in the fall. She asked if I wanted to be involved, not as a built-in babysitter or emergency childcare provider, but as a grandmother who could share wisdom and support without overstepping boundaries. "I want my child to know you," she said during one of our monthly lunches. "Not the version of you who sacrificed everything for everyone else, but this version. The one who knows what she's worth." The gift of being truly seen, valued for who I was rather than what I could provide, never got old. When my great-grandson was born in October, I held him for the first time with hands that weren't shaking from anxiety about doing something wrong or fears about whether I'd be allowed to continue being part of his life. I held him with the steady confidence of a woman who knew her place in his world was secure because it was built on love and respect rather than need and obligation. My son met his grandson a few weeks later, bringing carefully chosen gifts and genuine enthusiasm instead of the entitled attitude he'd once carried into family gatherings. He didn't ask to borrow money for anything related to the baby. He didn't make the conversation about his own struggles or needs. He just showed up as an uncle, learning to be trustworthy again. The photo Sarah took of 3 generations, herself, me, and the baby, captured something the old family portraits never had: genuine contentment. We weren't performing happiness for a camera. We were simply being present with each other. That Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner for my chosen family, Mira and her relatives, Maria, who decided to spend the holiday in Chicago instead of with her own complicated family dynamics in New York, Sarah and Tommy with their partners, my son, invited but not expected, arriving with a homemade dessert and no agenda except contributing to the meal. The conversation flowed easily between languages and generations. Stories were shared without anyone keeping score of who talked too much or contributed too little. Laughter came naturally instead of feeling forced. As I looked around my table, extended with folding chairs and card tables to accommodate everyone, I realized I'd finally created what I'd been yearning for all those years when I'd exhausted myself trying to force family connections that weren't sustainable. This wasn't perfect. People were complicated. Relationships required maintenance and communication and forgiveness for small failings. But it was real in ways my old family dynamics never had been. After dinner, while we were cleaning dishes and packaging leftovers, my son approached me in the kitchen. "Thank you for including me," he said quietly. "I know you didn't have to." You're right. I didn't have to, I replied. But I wanted to. There's a difference, and it makes all the difference. He understood. I could see it in his eyes. The recognition that earned love felt different than expected love, that chosen relationships were stronger than obligated ones. The holidays that year felt like celebrations instead of endurance tests. I participated fully without exhausting myself, contributed generously without bankrupting myself, loved openly without diminishing myself. On New Year's Eve, as I prepared for another trip, this time to Ireland with a photography tour group, I found myself writing in my journal with a sense of completion that hadn't visited me in decades. I spent 70 years learning to love other people, I wrote. These past few years, I've been learning to love myself. Both lessons were necessary. Both were worth the pain they cost me. The woman who'd discovered her son locked in a basement 3 years ago had died that Christmas Eve in a way. She'd died of heartbreak and betrayal, and the crushing realization that her love had been treated like a resource to be mined rather than a gift to be treasured. But something beautiful had been born from her ashes. A woman who understood her own worth, who chose relationships based on mutual respect, who loved generously but not indiscriminately. I was no longer anyone's personal ATM or emotional dumping ground or automatic backup plan. I was a person with interests, opinions, friends, adventures, boundaries, and self-respect. The city lights twinkled outside my apartment window as I finished packing for my Irish adventure. Chicago had been home for my entire life, but lately it felt like the launching pad for possibilities I was just beginning to explore. My phone buzzed with New Year's messages from the people who mattered. Maria, already planning our next adventure together. Mira, wishing me safe travels in her beautiful broken English. Sarah, sharing pictures of the baby's first attempt to crawl. Tommy, excited about the photography equipment he'd saved up to buy. Even my son, keeping his message simple. Happy New Year, Mom. Thank you for teaching me that love is a choice, not an obligation. At 71, I was just beginning to understand what that meant. Not just that I could choose who to love, but that I could choose how to love. With boundaries instead of desperation. With respect instead of martyrdom. With joy instead of duty. Standing at my window, watching fireworks bloom over Lake Michigan, I raised my glass of wine in a toast to the woman I'd become, and the adventures still waiting for me. If someone had told me 3 years ago that losing my family would lead to finding myself, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I was, surrounded by genuine love, planning trips to foreign countries, teaching photography to eager students, and waking up every morning excited about the day ahead. The basement key that had locked my son away had somehow unlocked my freedom. The family that had taken my love for granted had taught me what healthy love actually looked like. The relationships that had drained me for decades had shown me the difference between being needed and being valued. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened to you, if you're brave enough to let it transform you instead of destroy you. Have you ever lived or known someone who lived something like this? Share your story with me in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Together, maybe we can help someone else find the courage to choose love over fear, respect over desperation, and freedom over the prison of other people's expectations. Your worth isn't determined by how much you sacrifice or how much you endure. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you can provide. And if the people in your life can't see that, maybe it's time to find people who can. Life is too precious to spend it being invisible to the people you make visible. You matter. Your happiness matters. Your peace matters. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect not just you, but the possibility of genuine connection with people who are ready to love you the way you deserve to be loved. The sunset outside my window painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a masterpiece that existed without needing anyone's approval or appreciation. Like the love I'd learned to give myself, it was simply there, beautiful and complete and free. That's the secret I wish I could tell my younger self, the woman who gave until she disappeared. You are enough, exactly as you are. You don't need to earn love through sacrifice or buy affection through service. You are worthy of respect, kindness, and genuine care simply because you exist. And when you believe that, really believe it, everything changes. The people who belong in your life will step forward. The ones who don't will step away. And the space they leave behind will fill with possibilities you never imagined were waiting for you. In my case, it filled with friendship, adventure, purpose, peace, and a kind of love I'd never experienced before. Love without conditions, without obligations, without the exhausting need to prove I deserved it. At 71, I was finally home. Not in a place, but in myself. And there was nowhere else I'd rather be.